John Taylor lived a life most would call peaceful, but anyone who knew him, or thought they did, understood that peaceful was only the surface. Nestled deep in rural Texas, his farm stretched across hundreds of acres of rolling fields, dotted with barns, silos, and cattle pens. Mornings began before sunrise, with John walking the property, inspecting fences, checking water troughs, and making sure the crops were thriving. To a casual observer, he seemed like a man content with simple routines, a veteran who had traded battlefields for farmland. Yet every step he took, every glance he cast over the land, carried the precision of a man trained for combat, a man who had survived situations where a single mistake meant death. Neighbors often remarked on his quiet demeanor. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and preferred solitude, but there was a weight in his presence, a silent authority that made people instinctively cautious around him. Some whispered rumors about his past in Delta Force, but John never confirmed or denied anything. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words. The way he moved, the meticulous care in his work, and the subtle ways he surveyed the land suggested a man whose senses were always alert, a man who had seen more than most could even imagine. John's farmhouse was modest yet strategically designed. From the outside, it looked like any other rural home, with peeling white paint, weathered shutters, and a porch that creaked underfoot. But inside and throughout the property, John had quietly transformed it into a fortress of his own making. Hidden cameras blended seamlessly into the surroundings, motion sensors were discreetly tucked among the trees, and escape routes through the fields and woods were mapped in his mind with military precision. Every inch of the farm was planned not just for daily life but for survival. In his eyes, preparation was as natural as breathing. Even in the quiet of early morning, John's mind never rested. While he checked the irrigation systems or fed the animals, he simultaneously scanned the horizon, listening for unusual sounds, noting every vehicle or passerby, and analyzing patterns that others would overlook. The wind shifting through the crops, the faint crunch of gravel under tires miles away, each detail was stored, catalogued, and assessed. Most people would call this hypervigilance, but for John, it was instinct, hardwired after decades of operations in war zones where overlooking a single detail could cost lives. Despite the solitude, John's life was far from ordinary. His daily routines masked a constant readiness, a quiet intensity that never wavered. To an outsider, it was just a farmer tending to his land. But beneath that exterior lay a veteran prepared for anything. Years of Delta Force missions had taught him patience that now translated into careful observation and preparation. He had chosen peace, but he understood that peace was fragile, and danger had a way of finding even the quietest corners of the world. Word spread fast, like wildfire, that John Taylor's farm was sitting on something valuable. Rumors whispered through border towns and small communities, a retired Delta Force veteran with a seemingly quiet farm that hid more than just crops and cattle. For the wrong people, that was an irresistible target. A small cartel crew, hardened and ruthless, decided that John's farm would be an easy score. They didn't care who he was, only that he was a man who could be intimidated, a man they assumed would fold under pressure. Crossing into Texas under the cover of night, the cartel moved with confidence. Their trucks roared across back roads, the engine noise swallowed by the darkness, carrying men armed with high-powered rifles and a dangerous sense of entitlement. They scouted the property from a distance, plotting their approach, sure that no one could oppose them. Every movement was calculated, or so they thought. They didn't know that John Taylor's eyes were already on them, tracking, observing, analyzing. To them, it was a simple raid. To him, it was a test, a puzzle that he had already started to solve. The cartel underestimated the land itself. Rolling fields, hidden hollows, and dense patches of trees gave John natural advantages he could exploit. While they believed the open landscape worked in their favor, every hill and shadow became a potential trap. John had spent months memoizing every inch of his property, planning for scenarios like this. From elevated positions behind barns to hidden paths through the crops, he could move unseen and strike from places they would never imagine. The farm was quiet, but it was far from defenseless. As the cartel's vehicles approached the main gate, their excitement was palpable. They joked and laughed, confident that this would be a quick job, a story they'd tell back home about how easy it was to intimidate a man hiding behind a few acres of land. What they didn't notice was the subtle signs of readiness everywhere. A glint of metal in the moonlight here, a shifted camera lens there, and shadows that moved without human presence. John was already in position, every muscle tense, every thought racing through contingencies. Their confidence would soon become confusion, and confusion would lead to panic. Inside the farm, John had prepared silently. He didn't need to confront them immediately. Delta Force had taught him patience, observation, and the art of turning the hunter into the hunted. He studied their approach, marking their formations, weapons, and blind spots. He knew exactly when to act, when to create fear, and when to strike with precision. The cartel had no idea that their easy target was a man whose entire life had been a preparation for moments like this, a man who could dismantle their plans before they even reached the barn. The sun had dipped low behind the horizon, casting long shadows across John Taylor's sprawling farm. The golden light of late afternoon faded into a dusky orange, and the quiet hum of insects filled the air. Normally, this was John's favorite time of day, peaceful, calm, the perfect hour to walk the fields and check on his livestock. But tonight felt different. There was an unease in the wind, subtle yet unmistakable. Every rustle of the leaves seemed louder, every distant sound sharper, as if the land itself was warning him that trouble was approaching. From the corner of his eye, John noticed faint glimmers of headlights far down the dirt road. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor, perhaps returning home after a long day. But something was off. The vehicles moved cautiously, yet deliberately, maintaining a formation that suggested experience in planning and executing operations, something John recognized immediately from his military days. He ducked behind a low ridge and observed them carefully, letting instinct take over. Every movement, every pause, and every flicker of light was stored in his mind, analyzed with precision. The vehicles slowed as they neared the property line, headlights sweeping across the fences and fields. The cartel members were clearly trying to assess the terrain and gauge any signs of resistance, but all they saw was calm farmland. John remained perfectly still, blending into the landscape, his breathing steady. He knew that the element of surprise was still in his favor. He could anticipate their next steps, predict their approach patterns, and even plan how to manipulate their confidence against them. This was no ordinary trespass. They were professionals, but even professionals could be outmaneuvered. As the vehicles crept closer, John scanned for escape routes, choke points, and areas that could be used for defensive advantage. His mind raced through possibilities. What if they split up? What if they approached the barn first? What if they tried to circle around the back fields? Every scenario played out in his mind in real time, faster than most could think. He could hear the faint clink of weapons being checked, the rustle of tactical gear, the quiet mutters of the intruders coordinating among themselves. The tension was thick, like static in the air, waiting for the spark that would ignite the storm. Even with his calm exterior, John's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from readiness. He could feel the old Delta Force instincts stirring, a clarity that came only from years of operating in life-or-death situations. Every sound, shadow, and movement mattered now. The farm that had been his sanctuary was about to become a battlefield, and John was already 3 steps ahead. He remained motionless, watching, calculating, waiting for the precise moment when patience would turn into action and the hunters would become the hunted. As the dusk deepened into night, John Taylor's farm transformed from a peaceful homestead into a tactical stronghold. Every inch of the property had been designed for both survival and defense, and tonight, that planning would be put to the ultimate test. Hidden cameras perched in trees and barn eaves silently recorded the approaching cartel, while motion sensors embedded in the soil alerted John to each step they took. What looked like an ordinary farm to the untrained eye was now a labyrinth of traps, observation points, and kill zones, a deadly chessboard on which he had already positioned himself. The barn, which seemed to house only livestock and storage, was actually a reinforced structure, with hidden exits and fortified doors. John had spent hours reinforcing it, knowing that if intruders reached this area, he needed to control the engagement. Barricades disguised as ordinary farm equipment lined key access points, while noise traps and decoy lights would disorient anyone who stepped into the open. Even the grain silos and sheds were no longer mere storage. They had been converted into vantage points from which John could strike unseen. Every shadow could conceal him. Every corner could be a point of advantage. John moved silently across his property, checking each sensor and camera feed on his tablet. His military training dictated that he control not just the terrain but also the information. He could see the cartel members approaching, unaware of the traps laid in their path. Small details, like the slight shimmer of a camera lens or the subtle movement of a fence line, were invisible to them, yet they gave John complete situational awareness. He didn't need to rush. The night was his ally, giving him time to study, plan, and exploit the intruders' overconfidence. Even the perimeter of the farm had been carefully engineered. Hidden ditches, low-lying obstacles, and narrow access paths funneled potential attackers into predictable routes. John knew exactly how they would move, where they would hesitate, and where fear would take over. Each feature of the landscape had been studied, modified, and utilized to maximize his advantage. To the cartel, it might have looked like a simple farm, an easy target, but to John, it was a living, breathing battlefield, every inch accounted for and every weakness covered. As the first cartel vehicles crested the final hill, John remained perfectly still, his presence invisible. The farm, bathed in moonlight, looked serene and ordinary, but it was a fortress. Every trap, every sensor, and every defensive measure was in place, waiting for the intruders to make their first move. This was not a confrontation born out of anger or pride. It was a matter of survival. And John Taylor, the quiet veteran, was ready to defend his land with the lethal precision that had earned him a reputation few dared to challenge. Night had fully fallen, and the farm was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from the faint moon and strategically placed decoys that John had set to confuse intruders. The cartel, confident in their numbers and firepower, made their first move toward the barn, believing it to be an unguarded target. They advanced cautiously, whispering instructions to each other, rifles raised, expecting to intimidate a farmer into surrender. What they didn't realize was that every step had been anticipated, observed, and catalogued. John waited silently, a ghost in the darkness, ready to unleash his first calculated strike. Suddenly, a series of alarms blared, soft at first, then escalating, triggered by motion sensors that the cartel hadn't noticed. Floodlights snapped on in bursts, illuminating paths they thought were safe and forcing them to halt. In those brief, disorienting flashes of light, John moved like a shadow among shadows, striking with precision. Objects fell, doors slammed shut, and booby traps subtly deployed chaos, sending the cartel scrambling in confusion. They had expected resistance, but not this, a perfectly executed defense that seemed to appear from nowhere. John struck from multiple angles without ever revealing himself fully. The first attack wasn't just about force, it was about control. He used the barn's architecture, high vantage points, and his knowledge of their approach patterns to isolate groups of intruders, cutting off their lines of sight and disorienting them. Shots rang out, not indiscriminately, but with surgical precision, forcing the cartel to retreat behind trucks and crates for cover. Panic began to spread. The men realized quickly that this wasn't a simple farmer. They were facing someone trained in eliminating threats, someone who could read their moves before they made them. The chaos escalated as the cartel tried to regroup. They shouted commands, tried to coordinate attacks, and attempted to flank the barn from different angles, but John anticipated every maneuver. Tripwires triggered distractions, and improvised noisemakers further disoriented them. Shadows danced across the field as John moved silently, appearing in the corner of their vision only to vanish moments later. The cartel's confidence, once unshakable, now faltered. Each attempt to advance was met with confusion and strategic setbacks, turning their planned raid into a chaotic retreat. By the end of the first encounter, the barn remained secure, the cartel shaken and unsure of how many threats they were actually facing. John had not revealed himself completely. He had allowed fear to do much of the work. Every move, every trap, every flash of light was designed to create psychological dominance. The cartel had thought this would be a quick score, but within minutes, the situation had flipped entirely. The hunter had become the hunted, and the quiet farm was no longer just farmland. It was a battlefield where one man's skill and preparation ruled supreme. The cartel, shaken by the first strike, scrambled to escape, but John Taylor wasn't about to let them vanish into the night. Using his knowledge of the land and years of military training, he immediately went on the offensive. He knew every hidden path, every narrow ditch, and every thick cluster of trees surrounding the farm. With silent, calculated steps, he shadowed their retreat, forcing them to make mistakes without even revealing his full presence. The night air was thick with tension, the sound of crunching gravel and muffled voices echoing through the dark fields. As the cartel tried to regroup along a narrow dirt trail, John leveraged the terrain to his advantage. Low hills, dense thickets, and a small creek became natural choke points, restricting their movements and leaving them vulnerable. He anticipated their every maneuver, predicting their flanking attempts and cutting off potential escape routes. With strategic placement of tripwires and improvised noise distractions, he created the illusion of multiple attackers, making them believe the farm was swarming with unseen forces. Panic spread among the men as their confidence eroded into chaos. John's counterattack wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Using sudden bursts of light from his strategically placed flares, shadows flickered across the fields, making the cartel hesitate at every step. His voice, calm and commanding, occasionally broke the silence, calling out warnings in a tone that suggested an overwhelming presence. Each pause, each hesitation, amplified their fear. The men were trained for combat, but they were unprepared for this, a single opponent who could appear anywhere, anticipate every action, and exploit every weakness. The chase continued through fields and tree lines, John always 3 steps ahead. He forced the cartel toward terrain he had mapped out meticulously, areas where escape was nearly impossible and where he could isolate them one by one. Every movement he made was precise, efficient, and lethal in strategy. Even without lethal force, the terror he inflicted kept them off balance. The night became a labyrinth of confusion for the intruders as they stumbled, tripped, and misjudged distances, all while John controlled the flow of their retreat. By the time the first hints of dawn approached, the cartel was thoroughly disoriented and exhausted. Vehicles abandoned, plans thwarted, and morale shattered, they realized too late that the man they had underestimated had orchestrated every step of their undoing. John's tactical genius, combined with intimate knowledge of his own land, had turned a desperate escape into a controlled scenario where every advantage belonged to him. What began as a simple raid had evolved into a masterclass of strategy and precision, leaving the cartel scrambling for survival in a battle they never wanted to fight. As the first light of dawn crept across the fields, the chaos of the night had vanished, leaving behind only the quiet hum of a farm returning to its routine. The cartel was gone, their vehicles abandoned, weapons scattered, and morale shattered beyond repair. John Taylor moved calmly among the aftermath, inspecting the perimeter and making sure everything was in order. To the outside world, it appeared as if nothing had happened, just a farmer tending his land at sunrise. But for those who knew what had occurred, the events of the night would be whispered for years to come. Word of the failed raid spread quickly through nearby towns and border communities. Stories of the quiet Texan farmer who had turned his property into a fortress circulated in hushed tones at diners, gas stations, and small-town bars. Some called him a legend, others a ghost, but everyone agreed on one thing. John Taylor was not a man to be trifled with. The cartel had underestimated him, and their failure became a cautionary tale. What they thought would be a quick score had turned into a nightmare, leaving them with the bitter memory of a man who had been trained to survive and dominate any battlefield, even one that looked like farmland. John returned to his routines as if nothing had changed, feeding livestock, checking fences, and walking the familiar paths of his farm. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, his mind remained sharp, aware that danger could return at any moment. The night had reminded him that peace was fragile, even in a place as seemingly isolated as his farm. But it had also reinforced a truth he had always known: preparation, patience, and strategy were the ultimate weapons, and the right man could defend what mattered most without ever revealing his full power. Locals who glimpsed John that morning noticed a quiet intensity in his eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that something extraordinary had occurred. He didn't speak of the night's events, and no one pressed him, but the respect and fear in the air were palpable. Children whispered about the ghost farmer, while adults exchanged knowing glances, understanding that the peaceful homestead they saw was the surface of something far more formidable. The legend of John Taylor had begun, a story that blurred the line between myth and reality, leaving everyone to wonder what a single man, trained in the deadliest special forces, could accomplish if ever pushed too far. Even as days passed and life on the farm returned to a rhythm of work and quiet, the memory of the cartel's failed raid lingered. Stories of shadows moving in the night, sudden bursts of light, and a man appearing and vanishing without warning became local lore. To John, it was simply another night survived, another lesson in vigilance, and another reminder that he had chosen a life where strength and stealth were his constant companions. The legend remained unspoken but undeniable, a chilling reminder that some quiet men hide unimaginable power, and anyone who dared threaten them would quickly learn their mistake. As the sun climbed higher, casting light across the farm, John Taylor returned to his quiet routine, tending to the fields as if the night's chaos had been nothing more than a dream. But the truth lingered in the shadows, a reminder that peace was hard-won and never guaranteed. The cartel had learned the hard way that some men are not what they seem, that a single veteran could turn a quiet farm into a battlefield, and that courage combined with skill can outmatch even the most ruthless forces. The legend of John Taylor would not be written in newspapers or celebrated in ceremonies. It would live in whispers, in wary glances, and in the memories of those who dared to test him. To the world, he remained a quiet farmer, a man who preferred solitude over recognition. But those who crossed his path, or thought about it, would understand that some men carry a history of fire and precision, and that history does not fade with the passing of time. And so the farm returned to its quiet rhythm, the cattle grazing peacefully, the wind rustling through the crops, and the sun casting long shadows across the land. But beneath that calm lay a man ready for anything, a shadow in plain sight, a Delta Force legend whose presence alone was enough to turn fear into survival, and survival into legend. For John Taylor, the battle may have ended, but the story of the man who defended his land against impossible odds, would echo forever. Because in the end, some legends are built not on glory or recognition, but on the silent power of a man who refuses to be underestimated, and the quiet farm that became a fortress no one would ever forget.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.